Well, welcome back to Potter's Pockets 008. Today we're going to talk about chapters 1 through 3 in volume 2 of the Harry Potter series. Um, the worst birthday, so the Dursleys managed to make a birthday worse than the first 11. 2, Dobby's warning, and so we meet House-Elves, and that will open up a slew of issues, undoubtedly, that we'll continue to explore throughout the canon here. And 3, the Burrow. We get to see our first wizarding. Before we go too far, welcome back, Mr. Wes Schantz and Miss Sarah Miller.
Hey, how you doing?
Greetings, everyone.
It's good to be back. It's good to be back in San Diego and recording with all of you. And thank you for staying up late for us, Miss Sarah Miller. Miss Sarah Miller is on the East Coast. We're all on the West Coast, so she's 3 hours ahead of us.
Right. Appreciate it.
It's summer break, so.
Yeah, and the living's easy. It's a good time. So we not only wanted to talk about the first 3 chapters of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, just diving in there today, but also as sort of an interregnum or intermediary, we all read J.R.R. Tolkien's, I would say fairly dry, essay on fairy stories. And I definitely noticed that I prefer to read print, where I can use my hand and focus more of my neurons on reading and underline things than read off a magical glowing screen, which, well, I suppose it's getting more and more beautiful. And Tolkien was interested. It was interesting for him to note that the creations of our imagination and fantasy are often far more beautiful than our actual creations in cities, like smokestacks and ugly things like those. But I wanted to make sure to ask you a question about this, Wes, because you were talking about this notion of eucatastrophe. I wanted. What is it about this essay that you thought would be particularly relevant and helpful to us in our project here? Because I saw a couple, I think, glimpses of gold in there too, but you've mentioned this term eucatastrophe as opposed to discatastrophe, and I was just wondering what it is that you found so provocative about it.
I really like this essay. I know it is a bit all over the place, and it takes, I think, a little getting into it. But once you read it a few times, I think if you see more and more of all of the range of stuff he's talking about here, and so he goes into to magic and enchantment, which I thought was really relevant to Harry Potter, because that was kind of my big question starting to read these books again, was like, so what is magic? How does magic work? What is magic for? And what is it not for? And so I thought that would be a good place to kind of start from, right? Tolkien is similarly very he's very tough to pin down about what magic is in his works as well, and his works are so influential and stand loom so huge, in 20th century fantasy and just kind of literature, imaginative literature, speculative literature generally. So that was the first thing. But then as I was thinking about it more, I was like, whoa, the beginning of this book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, that is the first one, is a kind of eucatastrophe. In Tolkien's sense, it's the sudden joyous turn, but it happens before the story starts. It's like in the background of everything is Harry Potter surviving and Voldemort being sort of disembodied or whatever it is that happens to him. So it's all very mysterious.
Just like in Tolkien, where we hear the story that Sauron was defeated at the Interesting, very good. Yeah, and I like that the joyful moment that he actually, that is part of the definition of a eucatastrophe, a quick turn, kata down from, strophe turn, you good, so good downturn. Right. And so, which reminds me a bit of the idea behind the comedy, and I actually would be interested in understanding how you distinguish between a comedy and eucatastrophe. But Tolkien really focuses on that joy element, that there's a production of joy from this moment, and I imagine a moment of joy that we experience as well, and that's part of the addiction that we have to, say, Tolkien and also I'm blanking on Game of Thrones writer George R.R. Martin, right, and J.K. Rowling, that
all those people with the consonant, with the 2 consonants or 3 consonants in their name.
Yeah. The fantasy authors are disturbingly close to the killers, right? The lone killers, who are often, we get their middle names, right? But the fantasy authors have too. But so I'm wondering whether, do you think then the function of fantasy, or possibly the magic of these books is that the joy that the characters experience in a legitimate way is joy that we can then mimic and feel ourselves, so that the sort of alchemy or the magic of one of these stories that sort of creates the secondary world based on our primary world here, besides simply being curious, is to provide for us sort of a moment so perfectly orchestrated, or that has such a pleasant and different surprise for us, that it jumps off the page and into our own experience and hearts, in the same way that myth and history interplay for Tolkien. Him suggests, yeah, go on.
Oh no, go finish that up.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that it almost seems as if what he's saying is that myth is the ideal form of history that's constantly being interacted with by conscious mortals. That,
whoa, yeah,
and that the function of story, and that story actually will tend towards myth away from strict objective history. Point Herodotus over Thucydides here, because we will tend to idealize those who were originally maybe perhaps normal people, but we will then add sort of real people, but we'll add the archetypal characteristics that were once just a woman or a man to a specific king now, or first to a prince and then to a specific prince. Like, say, first, there's just a young hero, and then there's a young prince hero, and then there's an actual King Arthur. And
so now you're getting at, I think, the kind of hierarchy of myths that Peterson likes to talk about, which I think is there too, right? Like, so over time, the myths that are the most attractive, the most wish fulfilling and joy producing tend to be believed in or acted upon, at least. And I think that's where Tolkien winds up in this essay. And Sarah, you should probably get into this a little bit as well, because this is where he shows his hand, maybe as much as anywhere in his work, that he is writing from a place of Christian faith. And I think it's, well,
gospel as fairy story and as ultimate eucatastrophe. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's right. It's like the true myth, right? This idea that there's this particular story which has a special status, and within which, like, all of these other stories, in some sense, like, have their place. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if we lost Sarah or she's.
No, I know I'm here. I'm listening. I think you guys kind of distilled it the way I would say. I don't want to add anything that's just redundant.
Well, it's tough, right? Like, how does, well, I would ask to be more pointed about, like, where does Rowling fit into that? Does she, I don't know her like speeches and things as well, or if she's given talks and stuff about these topics at all. I don't know what your thoughts are about where she fits into this kind of scheme of myth versus fairy tale versus history, all of that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, I don't have the same background in, like, the history or study of myth that you guys do. I mean, I know, yeah, I've taught this essay before, and I think a really important part of Tolkien's view of the eucatastrophe is that it is not the perfect form of the comedy; it's the perfect form of the fairy tale, and it is not the happy ending, but the turn that makes any ending possible. I guess, if that makes sense. Like, so with my students, it's always really important to know that, or for them to identify that the sudden joyous turn is not the moment when the hobbits are bowed to by the crowned king. It's not when it's not the ending. It's not the coronation. It's the thing when, like, all hope seems lost. There's, like, the sudden turn from darkness to light that he goes out of his way to say, that does not deny the future possibility of pain. Which is that's his Christianity, is that pain is full. About this in another poem that Tolkien does called Mythopoeia, he he's much more he's much more poetic in his illustration of a worldview that like sees the story of Christ as like the true myth through which all other things like are reflected, or at least all what he thinks all other fairy tales are reflected. And I think it comes down to like what he sees as like a fundamental part of human beings, like of human nature. If to him fairy tales are like a story that every human being ought to have access to, well, what is it that they appeal to that every human being is or needs? Maybe it's a myth, I don't know, but it seems to me something that every human being has the capacity to do is hope, and whether or not those hopes are ever fulfilled is a separate question. But yeah, I'm not sure I have anything more to add beyond that. Like, you guys seem to have a pretty solid grasp.
Okay. No, I find that interesting that she puts in the kind of the beginning of her book this moment, and then it's kind of the moment to which everything converges, right? Whether you look forward or backward, and that's kind of where Tolkien ends up as well. I thought there was just a very interesting parallel there.
Yeah, and well, there were a couple things about that too that I just sort of tangentially wanted to touch on. The one thing that he said being that people tend to, I think of the form of epic and myth in reverse, that people think that epics come first, and then from those there are hero myths, and then from those are derived folk tales, when in reality, actually the epic is the crown jewel that is consciously created treasure chest, which a great researcher and poet will then put as much of the styles of those poets from the tradition before him into. He'll take his contemporary styles, if say he's Virgil or Dante. He'll take contemporary different language styles, like the language of Provençal and Arnaud Daniel and Dante. He'll take the epic writers from before, like stories about Homer for Dante and Virgil. And so that it is as if, as a culture, we develop our consciousness, so do we develop the way by which we transmit our myths. That as we become more detailed or more differentiated out, so do our myths become more differentiated out, potentially because we become wealthy and luxurious enough to produce people that can devote themselves to the luxury of studying letters and stories. And so that the crown jewel of, say, a people would be the production of the ultimate treasure house of their myth, which would be an epic. And that what I feel like is part of the power of Rowling and Tolkien here is that they get very close to that epic status, that they produce sort of myths and their scope is epic, but that there is something distinguishing fantasy, what I would call these as fantasies, from epic. And I couldn't do it maybe off the cuff right now, but I do think that
So I was just going to say, like, just as an example, today, my brother and I were texting because I saw this movie trailer for the next Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them movie, which features, is the subtitle of which is The Crimes of Grindelwald. Yes. And it looks, I'll be honest, it looks awesome. Yeah. But I mean, Jude Law, Dumbledore, sold. But I mean, that's beside the point. The point is, to your point, Alex, like it's epic in scope, right? Because there's this one moment where Harry is buying books at Flourish and Blots, which is, by the way, a great name for a bookstore, but in Diagon Alley, and he's buying Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them by Newt Scamander. And now there's this whole potential series of stories that are offshoots of this one great collection of myths.
This mythopoesis, right? Like you were saying earlier.
Yeah, like that there were 7 Harry Potter books, and now there's a play, and there's these new movies, but I think, to your point, like, and this is something that I know, Wes, you've asked before, like, well, what is it that makes these different from a myth? Well, I don't think it's as simple as, or from an epic, I don't think it's as, because there's magic or things that defy the laws of physics and nature as we know it in, you know, like other epics. But like there are monsters in other epics. There are demons, and there's things that don't exist in our everyday world. But I think he says that fantasy is about how you experience a story. It's about how it functions as a story. So that like maybe fantasy is like the fantasy epic, the high fantasy is like a subgenre of epic because it functions in a particular way. I don't know if that makes any, but one of those functions is the recovery function. One of those functions is the secondary world that's both believable and arrestingly strange. One of the functions is the escape, and then the eucatastrophe, which I think, you know, I've only read maybe like 4 or 5 epics, and maybe like the Divine I don't know, maybe the Divine Comedy and the Aeneid are really the only ones that seem to have this sudden joyous turn. But quite frankly, like they're not that sudden.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know. I wouldn't go so far as to say any of them have this moment when all hope seems lost, and then boom, like out of nowhere, there's the dawn rises and the stone table breaks and all of that. You know what I mean? Without it seeming, without like some crazy Deus ex machina that then makes the entire thing unbelievable. That's the thing. Like the eucatastrophe has to be believable within the scope of the world created. So, that's what makes it functional. Otherwise, it just feels fake or like
the internal consistency is the way by which you measure it. So, yeah, Wes, what were you saying?
Well, I just like the elements of recovery and escape there, and just to like get into the first few chapters of book 2 here, right? Like we've got an elf,
so much.
We've got Dobby the elf. We've got the flying car, right? And breaking Harry out, like sort of literally escaping from his Muggle chains there. And the other interesting thing though is that there's this like sort of legal element of not of misuse of improper use of magic, right? So there's something like the limits upon magic are very clear in these stories, and I found that really interesting too, where it's particularly the humans, and particularly the young humans, right? The children's use of magic, which is got this limit upon it, whereas the house elf, he seems to be able to do things within his own set of limitations, which remain mysterious at this point. So yeah, it's not like you can just sort of like wave your hand and anything happens. There's still rules, and there's still like emerging understanding of those rules as well.
Right, right. Cool. It's interesting. It reminds me of Emma Jung and Marie Louise von Braun's description of the young knight in their the Grail Quest work, where the young knight who sets upon the path to the quest at first identifies with the great hero, and so he becomes very proud and arrogant because he arrogates to himself the idea that he is an accomplished hero, like what he wishes to be, but is not yet. And so Harry, when he comes home, the idea about him is that now he is a terrifying wizard, right? And this is how he keeps the Dursleys and particularly Dudley in check. However, the case is that, as you said, he has extremely prescribed powers right now. Not only does he not have that much magic to his name yet, his transfiguration is what? He's capable of perhaps changing like a match into a mouse or something like that. Small stuff. But even beyond that, he's not even allowed to practice over the summer. So he's like that young knight or squire who's or I even think of like a college kid coming back home after tasting freedom for the first time, that he's sort of inflated by the sense of what magic has given to him, and he's going to be brought down a peg or two by seeing that even though he may have transformed quite a bit over this last year, when when he returns to the mundane world, the outside world, the effects of that which he has learned are not maybe so great as he might have imagined. Just to add one weird thing about Dobby, because I think this might be contentious and maybe a little too overly allegorical. I was wondering if either of you read. So I see a tremendous parallel between him and Harry. They both live in houses where they're mistreated. They both have potential far greater than that which their masters or person who guards them sees in them. They both have a tendency to do what they think is right rather than what they're supposed to. They both are totally okay with breaking rules. I just almost wondered, and I guess this is sort of a psychoanalytic reading of this. So the Dursleys have this get together where Vernon's going to make a giant deal, right? A deal so big that he can buy a summer home on an island, or was it in Spain? It was extraordinary.
It was in Mallorca.
Mallorca in Spain, right? And so like this is apparently a tremendous deal. But these Dursleys, even though Harry is part of the family and should want good things for him, they mistreat him so much that one has to wonder whether that might make some ill will jump into him, so that maybe unconsciously he wants to ruin their chance for success because they do not deserve it because of how unjustly they have treated him. And so Dobby might, in this instance, represent an unconscious misuse of magic on Harry's part, as if like he didn't even mean to, or something like that. It reminds me sort of like a Mephistopheles character with Faust through the window, and then making the thing that you want to happen, but taking responsibility for it, even though you have to catch the flack for it. It was technically that creature. It's maybe even a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I was wondering,
It's also the way that his friends have apparently forgotten all about him. You know, it's not just like a family, but he's in a dark place here because all the people he cares about most have apparently deserted him here. So
and those two eyes, it's almost like the trouble is inviting. It's like, oh, thank goodness, a magical thing. This was not because that was a concern.
I was just gonna say.
Go on, Sarah.
When he sees the eyes, he is like one page before, wondering if maybe he didn't have any friends at Hogwarts. Maybe it didn't really happen. But I like the idea of seeing Harry and Dobby as like having parallel characteristics. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I don't think we can, and again, this is like telegraphing what happens later in the story. I think that they do end up, like Dobby's decisions do end up foreshadowing Harry's decisions, right? They self-sacrifice, right? They are deeply tied to the welfare of those who are like them and those who are not like them. They seem to have a moral compass they can't quite get away from. They're rebellious. I mean, I don't think Harry is as interested in like self-flagellation as Dobby is, but
he hasn't had to be.
nor does Harry seem to feel guilt for breaking the rules in a way that Dobby does. So maybe Dobby in a way is like Harry, he can get away with things that Harry wants to have happen, but I don't know. I wouldn't only have him only serve that purpose. Yeah.
And
yeah. But I do think that I think he's he's mischievous. He's clearly outspoken. He seems to love Dumbledore. So in that sense, like he has he's got his head screwed on straight as much as a house elf could. But
so he's a force for good.
Yeah, I think, well, certainly the fact that he says Dumbledore is the greatest headmaster Hogwarts has ever known, automatically we know that he's on what side.
That's also Harry's perspective too, right?
Right. Right. And Hagrid's.
Yeah, and Hagrid's, that's right. And something I wanted to mention about the Fantastic Beasts, just because we've been talking about Dumbledore as God, what's interesting is you see in the preview that he says that he cannot fight this battle against Grindelwald, that an actual human will have to fight it, Newt Scamander. And so he will fight through the hero, sort of like we'll see near the end of this text, that it will not be Dumbledore who fights the snake, dragon, Voldemort, demon, devil, but that it will be a young hero manifesting the spirit of Dumbledore through his sword given by his phoenix. It will help so that the humans have to manifest the spirit of the divine, have to embody it. Yeah.
And Wes, to your the seemingly like the global eucatastrophe in this world of Harry surviving Voldemort's attempt to kill him happening before the story. I mean, if we want to reduce it completely to allegory, which I'm loath to do, as was Tolkien about his own works, but like one way of looking at that is that like Harry as like the modern disciple, like the global eucatastrophe that Tolkien speaks of happened in his mind 2,000 years ago. So each of us, Frodo, Sam, whatever, Harry, Alex, Wes, and Sarah, we are all, like bearers of that. And that, like, I think that's like, and yeah, and like that the eucatastrophe does not deny future suffering, but rather denies its ultimate victory. Yeah. That's what he says in the essay, that like it doesn't mean that it's not going to be sad or there's not going to be pain or weeping or death even, but like that it's not meaningless, it's not alone, it's not that kind of thing. Like I guess it whenever you read fantasy, particularly like a fantasy series, and especially when you get into something as like morally ambiguous as Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire, that like it just seems like there's constant eucatastrophe and constant catastrophe. Like there's nothing, there is no, I don't think there is eucatastrophe in Game of Thrones just yet, because it's nothing but rising action. And like and so it just because he wants you to keep waiting with bated sixth book, which I don't believe is ever going to happen until I see it. But like, I think that I mean, that's one way to look at what's at like the big eucatastrophe seems to be before this thing even starts. Yeah. Well, that doesn't mean it's the only one,
Well, yeah. And just to add a little to that, just from the epic traditions, the 5 big epics from the Western tradition as defined by Mortimer Adler, if the eucatastrophe is the acceptance of suffering, or the possibility of suffering in the future, not sort of a diluted lotus-like state, each one of the 5 epics has at least one moment like that. The Odyssey has the easiest one, where Odysseus, in the very beginning, book 5, leaves Calypso's island, where she explicitly says, if only you knew what sufferings awaited for you out there, you would never leave. And he says, I'll still leave. And, even though she's like, am I not more beautiful than your wife? He's like, you are, but I'm still going. And so he leaves precisely because everything's too perfect there. It's too fantastic. It reminds me of what the architect says to Neo in the second Matrix movie, where he says that the original Matrix, which was a place of perfection because he was bound by the limitations of perfection, he arrogantly said, failed because humans could not deal with it, because there was no endeavor in it. And so I guess I would say when I try and see the structure of one of these stories or identify Albus Dumbledore as like a figure of the divine, I'm not trying to reduce the story into like Tolkien warns against somebody doing and saying, oh, this is just a type of this story, and therefore now we know everything about it, but rather to try and identify the universal sort of types and archetypes that manifest in all stories, especially stories of a certain type like high fantasy, and then to see how they differentiate out. And so it's like I'm trying to see what's objectively there, but also, or rather, what is shared between this story and others, but also what makes it deeply unique at the same time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I get that.
So, yeah. Go on, Wes.
I thought that was interesting how, in that sense, Dobby is kind of like trying to stop Harry from accepting this dangerous role that
Yes.
he's right. He's trying to keep him safe, which is fine as long as you're,
As
growing
long
up
as you're
and you're
willing to live in hell, right?
well, yeah, and
Because that
it's
is perfectly where Harry is, right? Stuck in that place with those muggles who now hate him. Sorry, go on.
yeah. I mean, yeah, I was gonna say just as long as you're like a child, right, growing up, and you don't have the wherewithal to contend with the danger, perhaps you do just kind of wait your turn, right? But clearly after book one, he's proven himself. He's shown that he's capable of dealing with all sorts of baddies and coming out alive again. And so at the end, he has this dream, and I thought it was really interesting because it sort of
Yes.
it links back to the first book pretty clearly there, where he's in the zoo, right? And he's the
Yes.
underage wizard, right? So now he's been labeled, and that's no good. And then he's starving on the bed of straw, right? Oh, and he's so sad, he's so sorry for himself, and they're all laughing. But Dobby calls, Harry Potter is safe there, sir. Uh-huh. And it turns out when he wakes up, right, he's being busted out. So his friends he's been waiting for are actually there finally.
Yeah, it strikes me as so similar to the Odyssey in that what it seems like is that known territory, which is that which is safe, for one, does not stay safe because there will be dangers from the outside, and we'll see that happen with a breakdown of order as Voldemort comes back to power. Or excuse me, he who must not be named. Don't want to trigger warning.
Speak not the name.
But
Yeah.
yeah, speak not the name. Excuse me. How dare I? Overbold, typical Gryffindor. And but yeah, but so just like with Odysseus, who was with Calypso, a goddess who was perfect, he could be immortal. He got sick of that place. Why did he get sick of it? Because it was perfectly safe. The same reason that Westworld doesn't end up being perfectly great for the man in black, if anybody watches Westworld. That without danger, the ultimate pleasures of life are denied to one, or the ultimate joys of life. The ultimate joy of life seeming to be meaning, which is that which transcends suffering. So it's almost as if you have to, like Adam and Eve in Milton's Paradise Lost, choose to go down into the world and accept the fact of suffering and death in order to have the ultimate experience that a mortal can have, which is actually the meaning of being mortal, which is meaning or purpose. And so it's like, well, Harry, you could be immortal in this one way and never die, but you would also never live. Sort of like how I think the alchemist Nicholas Flamel is being represented or presented in Fantastic Beasts as sort of a white ghost-like figure who, I don't know if y'all have seen that trailer yet, but he looks like someone who's sort of alive and also dead at the same time, which is like how Harry is when he's back at home, right?
Right.
And so he needs danger. He needs risk. He needs the potential to break rules and to suffer in order to have meaning. I think Tolkien is right. I think Peterson and the Buddhists are correct in this. I think the Odyssey speaks to this. I think there are just abundant, excellent sources from every tradition across media that say, yeah, choose suffering and responsibility and your life can be full of magic. Choose the other thing and, maybe you won't die, but maybe you'll never live. But I think that's pretty flawed logic too, because certainly you will die.
That's the great escape, though, right? So Tolkien talks about that too, right? Somewhere along the line, he's like, there is the great escape, the escape from death. That's seems to be something that this book is about, right? Like the J.K. Rowling series is about the escape from death, and the right way to go about it and the wrong way to go about it, as we saw with the unicorn's blood and the sorcerer's stone last time.
Right. And so I guess part of this story still being an adolescent story, a story of changing from patient to agent in the world, is that the figures of liminality, the figures of limbo, the psychopomps who take Harry from the world of the muggles into the world of the magical folk are again outside of him. It's another pair of trickster sort of liminal figures. So instead of Hagrid coming on a motorcycle to take him out, and also on a boat to cross a water with him, now it is the Weasley twins, who we'd already identified as sort of liminal figures, as trickster figures, hermetic figures. They come with Ron with a a magic car, which is what? So half muggle and half magic right there. And we find actually that that Ron reads a comic about a funny muggle, and we find out actually that Fred and George have learned how to lockpick like a muggle. And we find out that Arthur Weasley here, Arthur, of course, being the name of King Arthur, though he's very poor, which is a deep irony, he works for the Department of, I forget the specific name, but Muggle Affairs, or people who like bewitch things, specifically keys that get smaller and smaller, which I think are until you can't find them when you need them, which I think is ideology versus logos, being able to actually think. Ideology doesn't serve you when you need it, because you never produce your own weapon. But so all these Weasleys seem to be sort of taken up with the Muggles. They seem to be interested in Muggles, and they seem to be sort of bridges between the world of Muggles and magical folks. They're very interested in the Muggles, and that puts them sort of low on the pecking order too, because of their. It seems like the aristocratic magical folk stay as far away from Muggles as possible, whereas the more democratic ones, who believe Muggles are not lesser, they seem to be very fascinated by them, and that helps them. So just to say things in a long sort of way, one thing I might be interested in looking for as these books go on is whether Harry becomes more and more the agent of the transformation from the mundane world to the magical world, or whether he'll be taken each time by some other agent, some other psychopomp, some Charon or River Styx crossing figure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting here that he really needs a lot of help to bust out this time.
Yes.
More so, like I guess it's interesting that it's not an official person sent from the school either, but his friend and his friend's brothers, right, who become a bit more involved in the story here, who come and do it this time. So it's like it's moving closer to him, at least in this one, to follow that trajectory. I think will be cool. The other thing I just noticed that I wanted to throw in was the whole idea of eyes, like looking at him. So we see it with Dobby, but then just at the end of chapter 3, we see it with Ginny or Ginny. How do you say that?
Yes, Ginny from Ginevra.
Yeah. Okay, so she's peering at him.
Brown eyes.
From through the chink in the door. Yeah. So she clearly has got a kind of important role, although she's just sort of there in the background at this point.
Usually you can't get her to shut up, Ron says.
She'll of course grow into a very important character here.
That's interesting. We see sort of multiple manifestations of nature popping out then in that respect. If Dobby, potentially from one reading, is some sort of instinctual aspect of Harry that will need to be freed, then Ginny is also representation of nature and like sort of budding consciousness of the feminine and entering into soon a conscious relationship with it. Not quite ready yet for that. She's not quite ready to approach him and interact with him, but perhaps soon. But I have a question for y'all, just sort of as a fantasy question. What do you think of the inversion of being? So we have produced for us at the beginning of the second book an elf, which is a figure of fantasy. But this elf is totally inverted. This is no high elf. This is no elf of great lore and creation for creation's sake, as Tolkien say elves are, that they are creations that value creation and are the sort of angelic creation by the human mind. But that this elf is a lowly slave, ugly, pointed nose, far more like a goblin than a traditional perspective on an elf. And though he does seem to have strange powers that humans do not know much about, and seems to perhaps be of some sort of ancient caste of creature that we cannot fully understand. But why is it that you think that we have this inversion, that this elf is enslaved, or that elves in this world happen to be enslaved?
That's interesting. I mean, I was thinking about him in terms of the gnomes too, right? There's like these little creatures that pop out of the garden when you're not taking care to keep them out.
They were nothing like Santa Claus.
Yeah, but then there's these elves which are apparently inherited along with like great old houses and great old families have them. So I thought there was something there, kind of to trace the line of descent um, of these magical creatures. You have these ones that they are in a sense high, right? But they've been enslaved, which seems like very ripe for sort of metaphor, right? So it's like this great power of magic which is being um, ignored and put to negative uses and
And lowly uses beneath its sort of like a dark side of the force sort
oh
of
yeah,
idea that so and what's interesting is that recalls me another point that Tolkien talks about in his fairy stories. It just is we first see the sky, but then we can derive adjectives to describe it, and then we can pull them apart. We can say first there's sky, but then there's blue sky. The first way we're ever presented house elves is house elves and aristocratic magic folk. They're one and the same. They're all part of the same family. It takes
Mhm.
our differentiating minds to just look at the house elves. So the natural way to look at it is what aspect of the family of the aristocratic magic folk do the elves represent, and perhaps the abuse of their innate magic or creative quality in order to maintain their static or rigid position in society or something like that, that like you said they've put that which is of high value to low use. I think even Tolkien has a quote like that, right? That the
Yeah,
high is being subserved to the low in that respect.
yeah. One place at least is he's talking about the use of fairy stories for children, right? They're
Yes,
sort of
yes,
relegated to the nursery or something like that. So
right.
yeah, and in a way, the high elves, yeah, I think are kind of angelic in some sense. And Dobby is, yeah, like a little, he's like a funny little doll or something. He's diminutive and squeaky and cute. I mean, it's just the little Dobby with his little slippers, it's
Little Dobby.
but he's in a way, I think, a very good pair with Ginny because he looks on Harry with such admiration, right? And such, he expresses it, of course, very differently. But yeah,
Huh. Well, so let's move to the burrow.
yeah,
So one interesting thing about this is we get the continued theme that Ron is nervous about being seen as poor to Harry. So from the very first time he ever met Harry and felt sort of bashful about admitting that he had hand-me-down robes and hand-me-down wand and couldn't afford all that candy that Harry could. But Harry sort of made friends with him by saying that no, he had been similar and used to have hand-me-downs too, and he had just inherited all this money, so he didn't really deserve it. Sort of like his fame, his claim initially being, and they sort of put that to rest. But we see the same sort of concern arise here. The burrow has been sort of ragtag put together over time. It hasn't been sort of planned, so it's sort of a representation of society or culture in that respect, like a tree. It seems to be the idea behind how it grows in an organic way, bottom up, and also has a figure of the Great Mother in it, Mrs. Weasley, and also of sort of great demiurgic father as well, I would say, the Ronald or Arthur Weasley, the great
yeah,
king of this castle. But Ron, when he shows Harry into his house, not only is he like, no, we would never have a house elf, we just have gnomes, we have a stupid banshee. Then he shows him a small room that Ron almost hits his head on. He's outgrowing that, just like he's outgrowing his sort of family right now as an adolescent. He's soon going to be, his own man. But it's again, all of this is new to Harry, just like it's all new to us, and so it's wonderful to him. And so it's like Ron is continually missing it. It's like, Ron, you are Harry's best friend and liaison to a magical world, literally a magical world. You
yeah.
are you are like a lightning rod for joy.
Right.
but 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 Ron sort of perhaps it's a habit of him to be ashamed of the sort of poverty of the home. But what that sort of shows to me is that he just mistakes uh, material success with real success, because the home seems to be a very successful home, right? Everybody is magical. They are all Gryffindor and brave. There are 5 children. It does work, even though it's like patchwork put together. There's a stable society, and I mean, the family is a very proud family to have, or one should be proud to have such a family and be part of such a family. And Ron does seem to be, but
Yeah, I
yeah,
love the burrow. I mean, I love that it's called the burrow, and it it
yes,
goes up into the sky. So
right,
it's this down yet up sort of thing from the beginning. Uh, the mother, of course, and the father are delightful characters. Um, her sort of like attraction, she fancies Gilderoy Lockhart.
yes,
That's pretty cute. And she's got like the radio on, like the singing sorceress is crooning or whatever. So yeah, I mean, you could just sort of like really enter into this world, and that's, I think, pretty crucial that this book we get established in book 1, the distinction between the magical and the muggle worlds. But here we finally get to see like a wizard's house, which is
yes.
fantastic. Um, and so it's great because, yeah, Ron is seeing all of the negative things about it. He's at that
So
age,
much space to him too.
and yet, from Harry's perspective, which is a lot like our perspective, this is just, I mean, this is the greatest thing. Uh, and I think for kids, you know, for kids reading the book, I don't know about others, but like I had a real small family, and so it was like it was so cool to get to see what it would be like, to have this like bunch of people all in the house together, and like all the chores and all the activities suddenly become like much more fun because you're like with all these other people all the time. Um,
Yeah, more
eh,
more games that you can
yeah,
suspend disbelief in conjunction with. That was something I was noticing. So again, just something about the Tolkien essay. He says that a good piece of fantasy, like a good game, allows you to suspend your disbelief so you can simplify the world for a small amount of time, and then sort of squeeze optimal meaning and passion out of a situation by striving towards a very simple and coherent goal, like actually score a goal if you're a soccer player or something like that. But yeah, I had the same feeling. I also came from a small family, and just the fact that they made the chores in a Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer sort of way into a game. How far can we chuck these gnomes? And also the idea that that could have not only been boring but dangerous, right? Because if the gnomes smell fear or lack of competence, they bite you like they did to Harry. And he could have been a poor sport about it, and he could have not gotten into it. And so it's sort of like teaching a young person, and perhaps even us too, the sort of metagame, right? It's like if you get into something, if you allow yourself to suspend disbelief, life actually gets better for that amount of time, and then better in general. And then people actually might invite you to play more games. And so, that becomes a good experience for Harry, rather than just like a dull humdrum experience that would have never been included in the story at all.
I think there's an important distinction, and I might get this wrong, but Tolkien is quoting the thing about suspension of disbelief, but that's not his coining. That's from, I think, and he's critiquing it a little. He's like, well, that's not quite. I mean, I think the way you described it is, I think, a lot like what Tolkien is saying, but he wants to say that it's more like what happens is you enter into this world because it's that compelling, and that it's not real, and you're not like working against your sense of it not being real. Like, it doesn't matter that it's not real, right? In some sense, it is real because it's that cool. It's the game, right? Like, while you're playing the game is real. It's everything, and so to have that sort of perspective of something is the mark of like a great work of art. Yeah, and so that's kind of like what's going on here, right? And it's not really Harry's willingness or unwillingness to get into it. It's like the thing bites him, and he's like, "Oh, this is serious. I gotta fling it. I gotta fling it away." So it's like
sort of like life, in that there is not a non-serious way to play it. You can either be having fun or it can be biting you.
Yeah, and that seems to be the sort of magical thing about reading fantasy, right? Like it really like it sinks its teeth into you. You could imagine like the Matrix or something, right? A totally convincing drama, right? Tolkien wants to like sort of imagine what the fairy and drama would be like. You'd be so immersed, right? You'd be, and that's dangerous. That's actually quite dangerous. So
Well, it seems
maybe,
quite dangerous because of the fact that if we can model, an ideal place in fantasy, then we can then affect change in our own actions as we pursue embodying that sort of fantasy. Sort of the interplay that Dante talks about with Beatrice's ideal and Dante as pursuer of the ideal in the Paradiso. At each level he goes up of the Paradiso, the more he learns, the more beautiful Beatrice becomes, meaning that the sharper he becomes, the sharper his ideal becomes. And so the idea here being that the better we can visualize the ideal future, the more we can sharpen our actions or refine our actions or enact our actions in such a way as to bring about that sort of future in a better or more efficient way. And so just as like a very big question and hypothesis, it would be, I wonder if we indulge in this sort of collective mythopoetic fantasy making in order to produce a collective image of heaven to collectively pursue in a conscious sort of way.
Yeah, I mean that's a big one to kind of like encapsulate something about. I mean, it does seem to be a matter of wish fulfillment, right? And like the way that you go about that seems to be like dramatized in some sense here. The funny thing too is, like, I think we talked about this in the beginning of the other books, the way that there's things that are concealed, right? And that gets a little bit of a comic treatment here as well. The deception of Mr. Weasley with his flying car, right?
Yes.
Becomes laid bare here. So there's conflict on that level as well, where it's like you've done something which is wrong, right? You know that it's wrong. And then it turns out to, it's the way that they rescue Harry, like they bust him out with it. So it's like, I think that's a big part of the eucatastrophe element. It's like something that you think is a bad thing turns out to be a good thing, and like, even if you are deceiving and you're doing wrong, like that too can work out to the best, by luck or by whatever.
Yeah, the coming of consciousness as an act of thievery, a Promethean act, a Bilboan act. Which is interesting because then Arthur Weasley, as sort of a Prometheus, would have been giving flight to a car, sort of like giving consciousness to it, which we'll actually see is actually literally true, because the car will manifest a consciousness later on as it returns to nature, whence it came as a manufactured product, which would be just a very interesting sort of idea. That the car can, I'm sorry, I'm losing my point, going on that dang tangent like usual. Sorry, I lost it.
I'm seeing some italics. I don't know. Are you talking about like he wasn't intending to fly the car?
Oh yeah, very good, very good. The unintended consequences coming about through the gift of consciousness. Sort of like, so he just sort of gives the car the ability to fly, sort of like in the Adam and Eve story. There just is a tree that can give you consciousness. That can, teach you good and evil. And it's like, I'm not intending for anybody to use it. I'm just making this exist. So, and I forget, who was it that says that the very famous director that says, if there's a shotgun on the mantle in the first act, then it better be used by the third.
That's Anton
Chekhov. Very good. Yeah, thank you. Not a famous novelist, then, I guess, or playwright too. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
He was.
Of course, playwright. Yeah, 3 acts. And so this car was meant to be used in some way to bridge the gap between the magical and the Muggle world, even though that would technically be illegal. I guess something just interesting about that is, just like House-Elves have to self-flagellate themselves so that the aristocrats can keep their hands clean, because they're not punishing the elf punishes itself for its own incompetence, and so that justifies their perspective on their lower nature because they're punishing themselves, which is sort of circular reasoning. So does Arthur Weasley sort of, well, it's not my fault, even though his wife sees through that. She sees the loophole for how he created this car was written in by him so that he could do this, ideally so that his mischievous sons could use it to test his theory about it, which he seems very deeply interested in. How did it work, he says. Though that is not the appropriate thing for him to say, because the great mother, Mrs. Weasley, she turns beet red at that, and well, then the children have to leave the table. Yeah, it reminds me a bit of Zeus and Hera, though Hera made even larger than life in this case, even larger than Zeus. Yeah. So I guess the point I was just obliquely making is that Arthur seems to be doing with that car what Dumbledore was doing with the challenges in the castle in the first story. That like sort of like a figure of the Great Father or of the divine puzzle master. He sort of puts the pieces of the puzzle on the table, and the young conscious individuals or who are manifesting heroism or becoming who they are going to have to play that puzzle or play that game. And that he takes great interest in like sort of the data that's produced. So just like Dumbledore is very interested in what Harry did on the night against Quirrell Voldemort, so is Arthur Weasley very interested in the night that his sons and Harry have just had as well. Not exactly sure where I'm going with that, but I was just trying to parse out whether there was that sort of parallelism there.
I was curious about the role of the book here. If I could just like shift gears to that, because we're told about this Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests.
He knows his household pests, says Mrs. Weasley.
Yes, and so the book and him Gilderoy are sort of like the same thing, right? It's a big photograph of a very good-looking wizard on the front, right? So it's like that made me immediately think of, okay, so like where we're headed is this diary, right? And just to think a little bit about this example of the conflation of the person with the book, or the person with the story. That seems to be like a really interesting little theme that's going on here, where that's of course like fame, right? Like Harry Potter is famous because of this story.
Because
so
go on.
Well, it's funny because it's like we're gonna see how differently people react to that sort of thing, right? Like Ron befriends him because he also can sort of like see that there's just a person there, and then on the other hand you have people like Ginny who like are just blown away and like they can't even like bring themselves to talk to him. The mom just treats him like one of her own, like a kid that needs a mother, right? So there's all these different ways to interpret, right, that situation. So yeah, I just think it's cool.
Yeah, and Sarah, I don't know, do we have you over there? Sorry, we've been sort of dominating it here.
Yeah, no, I'm just listening. I'm just listening.
Yeah. Well, me too. Well, so I have a question for maybe both of you, but whether you distinguish. So, Wes, you brought up, I thought, very interesting, the idea of the story and the person, the relationship between a person and the story. We'll see that with Ginny. We'll then get caught up in the story of Tom Riddle, and we'll get sort of possessed by him in a similar, not the same way as Quirrell gets sort of possessed by Voldemort in a certain way, or by a dark idea, but that we also see Lockhart and his face on a book. And so I was wondering whether there was a distinction maybe between the relationship between a person and their own story and image and reality in this case. That what sort of Lockhart sort of is like, and a lot of people will probably say like sort of like President Trump in the advertising sense that is that he puts forward an image that's different from how he actually is. He puts forward the image of these stories of tremendous competence, which because of the positive halo effect, because he's very handsome and a very good advertiser, people believe and will concede to him. But in reality, we'll find out he's actually the opposite of a good teacher or a good role model. The only thing he can do effectively is confound, right? Rather than enlighten or illuminate, he can confuse and destroy your memory. And so sort of what he starts to represent for me is, on the first hand, he is the sort of fraud or phony that you would see in our regular world. So he's an addition from our primary world into the secondary world. Yeah. And two, that, well, just how that would specifically manifest in a strange and different way in this magical world. So I wonder if you didn't put your finger on the button of the difference between a character and their story being the sort of the substance, and a person and his projected image or persona being I don't know, the superficial aspect of a person or a story or a life. I don't even know if that's a coherent question at this point. Really reaching today.
I think I'm seeing something there. I mean, like, it's always an interesting dilemma. Like, how do you approach a work? Do you deal with the author's context and their situation and their life and where the work fits in their life? Or do you try to take the work on its own and somehow read sort of within it and what it shows you within that and deal just with that? And I think there's pros and cons to both, of course, but there's a real danger of mistaking one for the other, or like thinking that there's a total overlap between the person and their story, or whatever kind of work it might be. And I think the most important image, I think that's there, is like the image of the perfected, the finished, the final word on something. And if you think you've got that, then I mean, of course, you're set up for disillusionment, right? Because there's always more, and the story is still developing, right? We meet this guy in the next chapter or two, right? He's still doing stuff, so you can't have the final word on him, and that seems to be like a little bit of what Mrs. Weasley's got going on. If she fancies him, right? Well, she's got this ideal of him that she's fallen in love. Well, not, whatever. She's got her little illusions, and she seems to be aware that that's like not good. She blushes. She's ashamed, but she can't help it, right? Like there's always that temptation, to have the kind of overlap or mistaking the image versus the reality, right? And sometimes maybe it's harmless, but I think it's a really interesting little thread, I think, that I'm going to try to watch for as we go through.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, go on, Sarah.
I was just going to say, it's an interesting contrast to Dobby, who's so like physically unattractive, right? Or just these like, well, but not really. I mean, like the way he's described is like not at all cute. Like, I mean, yeah, his like eyes gaze up at Harry with like adoring admiration and they twinkle, but he's also a creepy little elf and like basically in like rags, right?
Yeah, with very sharp
with, like,
features.
gross little fingers.
He's not described as cute. You're right.
No, so I mean, he's not even like a troll doll with like the little gem in it, and they're not cute because they're creepy.
True.
But like, I don't know, like Dobby tells the truth, and he's not I mean, he tells the truth, but tells it slant. Like he doesn't tell the whole truth, because he can't. But we later find out that Lockhart is a fraud, but he like trades on his looks, and I think part of it is the intent to deceive and to make money off of deception. That's gross, right? And like, you brought up our dear leader, so I don't have to, but like but like that is intentional deception and gaslighting 101, 102, 401, 402, whatever. Like, but I guess, I don't know, Mrs. Weasley to me is like, like you said, Wes, like she knows that she's a victim of it, but she maybe can't help herself. And I think that's the thing about stories, though, is that like stories aren't always like good teachers. You know, they can be, but like they don't always. I mean, they certainly never give. One story never gives a whole picture, no matter how great or classic it may be. And like a story's, though, I mean, you know, and like the case in point would be like in Tolkien's world, the great story. Like how misused does that great story get? How many Christians or self-professed Christians are there walking around who think taking kids away from their parents is morally acceptable? Like how many of those people are that? Like that's an abuse of story. I guess maybe that's something that we're going to see of this particular story, no pun intended, but maybe it's something that was a thread in the first book, is that appearances are not often, not only are they not often real, like our perception can be deceived, but they're certainly never complete.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so like, and that's not the same thing, right? Like not only like we can be deceived by what we're seeing, but also how complete of a picture.
Well, let me jump in on that, because you just gave me a good thought that I think might help answer Wes's question in an actual coherent way. What it is that Mrs. Weasley likes about Lockhart is the story that has been sold to her about him. So what she likes is actually admirable, right? It's the story of this hero that has faced danger, that is a great man who is now going to then teach Harry, whom she loves because she loves Harry, for one, but also because her family loves Harry and she deeply loves her family. And now Lockhart is going to self-sacrificingly be his teacher. And we see that Hermione also falls for him too. Just something interesting to put about that is that seems also to be why Ginny likes Harry too. The story about Harry, though Harry has actually lived out his story. So that might be a difference between how Harry actually embodies his story and Lockhart sort of contrives his story. There's a difference between what he sells and how it works differently from Harry, or that's very different from Harry. But just something weird about that, because you said that maybe the story doesn't teach the best lesson here, but it possibly also does teach something real here. Because recently, Wes and I read this book, A Billion Wicked Thoughts, by Ogi Ogas and Sai Gadam. And one of the people, so they did all these studies, and they had this person an anecdote here of a lesbian meeting Bill Clinton. And she said that even though she didn't like Bill Clinton personally, it's after Lewinsky, she couldn't help but be attracted in his presence. And even though that her sexual orientation was not towards men. And so Saigadam and Ogi Ogas are like, why would that be? And there seem to be status receptors for humans that are governed by our serotonin systems. And I think part of our limbic system in the back of our brain. But basically, high status individuals, humans cannot help but be attracted to and will actually stare at for longer periods of time. So even though Lockhart is a fraud, he is still famous and therefore high status, and famous enough to get a position at Hogwarts too, and to sell millions of copies. And so even though he might not deserve what he has, you might say that maybe about Kim Kardashian or something like that, because they have no talent, but are perhaps very beautiful, or no manifested talents anyway. But that what we start to see here is a real part of our world, perhaps an unfair part, but also a real part and a natural part. That the people who are sort of the famous people, the top dogs, they get the affection, and even if that's seemingly irrational.
Right, but those are interesting, and I definitely think that that's right. Like, possibly also because possibly also because people who are in those positions carry themselves differently, and maybe it's that the viewer is captivated by their status, maybe it's that they are aware of their status, so they carry themselves in a different way that is their, I mean, maybe that's what's captivating. But my I think my point, maybe I wasn't I'm tired, so I'm not being clear.
I know
but,
it's late for you.
And my brain is not thinking
Confront
clearly at
this
the moment.
charm.
But my exactly, I've been confounded. But that part of the responsibility to that is in the eye of the beholder. I hate that phrase because it's so cliche, but like, and that's why maybe that's why she blushes. Maybe it's not. Maybe she blushes because he's a cute guy on the back of a book. Like, and like, she's a middle-aged woman who's like maybe not as beautiful as she was on her wedding day, but has certainly not lost her charm. But like, I guess, what I meant when I said that not all stories are good is that stories are tools, right? And they can be used for ill and they can be used for good, and how they are used, right? And that's what we'll see eventually, is that like all that is a freaking journal, and it gets used for something really evil. The journal in and of itself becomes like, it's transformed into a tool, like an object of evil. But like, there are tools for,
like people say of guns and Martin Heidegger's philosophy after he turns Nazi.
I mean, I don't want to get into a debate on guns because I actually don't feel that way about guns. But like, I
mean, just a general perspective
like,
on them.
Yes, but that like things like, and I guess you could say the same thing about ideas.
Yes.
Ideas can be used, and part of what makes an idea or a story, like part of what makes it like dangerous is when it is a ill thought out idea, or when it is an unquestioned idea. And so like nobody has thought to question Gilderoy Lockhart, because look at the man, he's so freaking good looking. Like, nobody has thought to question any of these people in power. Look at them, they're so beautiful, they make so many nice movies, they have so much money. Let's never ask questions of how they treat other people. Like, and we're in a time where I think a lot of these questions are being asked, and I think some of them are being asked in a way that's like maybe not the best way, but whatever. But like, it's a time of real tension. It's just easier not to ask questions sometimes. I mean, like,
yeah, but something very interesting about what you were just saying is that it's almost as if the stories were fed about those in power, whether from, say, movie fame or sports fame or political fame, as oversimplifications, because of our capacity to receive information via social media. Like, those stories, perhaps we're at a time when so many people are getting blown up who are famous, is because we are so capable of blowing holes in those stories so fast, because we can actually see the real shape of people's lives as people rather than as public figures or figures of fame, right? Because part of like their glamour, like in an elvish sort of way, is when you look at like the home run hitter, he is like the great hero. But then when you find out that, you know, he cheated on his taxes and did cocaine at one time and also HGH, it's hard to project that image of heroism on him anymore. He's all too human. And so it's as if these figures that we once projected greatness onto because of their status, we're now chipping away at those images in order to see the person as they are. And maybe that's even a good thing. But also what you were saying. I just wanted to bring up Tolkien's quote there, the Latin phrase abusus non tollit usum, which means, you know, how something is used, or how one used something should not define does not define the thing itself. So, you know, if somebody uses a sword to kill somebody, that's not the sword's fault, it's the person's fault. Seems to be the idea behind it, or the basic idea behind that quote. And that seemed to be what you were saying about the power of story too, that it's not a story or an idea that's necessarily evil, but the application of it in the world. And so that it's not, say, like Gilderoy Lockhart's story that's evil, but it is his misuse or fraudulent use eighth circle of Dante-like use of his story, which is so evil and potentially, I don't know, I guess this is the end of the book, so we shouldn't get into it, but is that what happens with the story of Tom Riddle, the diary of Tom Riddle, that it's a story that potentially has malevolence in it or something, and that it exerts an effect on Ginny that she's not prepared to have. Then I don't know how to ask the question. It's almost as if the idea behind that story is that that a bad story or a powerful enough story can corrupt the will of a human. I don't know if I can verify that yet. We have to get to the end of the story, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know that we have to get to the end of the story, but also we never ever learn what the story says.
Right. Oh, that's a good problem.
Right. That's completely. I mean, all we ever see is what it says to Harry. So, like, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I guess that you want to absolve the user of being manipulated by this thing, but. And maybe you can because of her age and her youth and her inexperience or whatever. But I don't know, just to get it back to the burrow, like, I mean, that's, I think, part of why, oh man, I'm losing my train of thought here. I just wanted to say that I think part of why we have at this point in the first novel, there's so many parallels in the first 3 chapters to the first 3 chapters of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
Maybe we can lay those out in detail in the next episode too.
Yeah, but just that, like, the 3rd chapter in the first book is where Harry's like exposed to magic for the first time. This is the 3rd chapter is where he's exposed to a magical family. And I don't know, I think we're supposed to see the Weasleys as the ideal, even if they don't have money. But like this big, vital, buzzing, exciting family that has like I mean, Mrs. Weasley goes from really angry to really kind of coquettish to demanding to she's everything in these chapters. And I mean, she's extraordinarily ordinary. Like, she is I mean, you know what I mean? Like she's got all the ordinary books in her, like, that you'd expect a homemaking wife to have: a cookbook, a gardening book, a book for all of the fast solutions to things. She's snarky with her children. She's she knows exactly how to scold each of them,
including the dad.
I don't know. Yeah, including the dad. And like she's passionate, she's loving, she overfeeds Harry. Like I see her as very ordinary. And like there's something really warm about her, but like she's also imperfect, right? Like, so she finds this Gilderoy Lockhart creature. I mean, she seems perfectly happily married, but he's so good looking. Like, I don't know. There's something. I just thought that's it's significant that they're like a really imperfect family, right? Like the husband's breaking the laws, but whatever. The 2 brothers get into trouble all the time, right? Like Percy's a prat, right? But they love him anyway. Like they're everything. Nothing is perfect, and there is a perfection in them. And I don't know, like that's more important than in the Dursleys' house, where everything has to be perfect and nothing is, right? And it's so fake. I don't know. I don't know how that's related to our question of appearance.
Well, possibly a difference between, like, say, a tyranny and a democracy there, but also just the fact that you say that it's so perfectly ordinary. It is also purely fantasy, and the fact that a sort of symbol or secondary reality could be so internally consistent with our primary reality here, or primary world, that we would think that this woman is presented in a perfect way. Like, that seems to be what you're saying, that She is the perfect representation of an
Mhm.
ordinary person with all her foibles and flaws and individual differences, as you would imagine it.
And she knows magic.
Right.
Like it's almost as though, right? It's almost as though that's like the most extraordinary and unusual
Yeah.
thing about her.
Well, maybe
But
that's
you
the
accept it as
yeah.
real.
And
You
the way
accept,
she even
you
sees
accept it as real
time to do
because
this, time to do this.
yep, like she seems so much like a mom. Like, and I don't, maybe she's, and I don't think, I mean, not all moms are the same, but like she seems to have all of the
Yeah.
elements.
Including the magic.
But I think that that's significant. Yeah. Well, and let's be real. I don't know about yours, but my mom is pretty magical. If I think about all the shit that she does and the shit that she puts up with, like, I mean, there is an ordinary, like, primary world magic in motherhood. Principally speaking, their bodies grew another human being, and I mean, you laugh, but like your body can't do that. Like, I mean, and that is just that's the magic of, that's the magic of creation that we're supposed to have awe and wonder at when we close the book, right? That's like femininity recovered. Like you don't think of femininity as Kim Kardashian. You think of femininity as like what a woman like has been created to do, right? And how that's
Kardashian
magic.
gets a lot of her fame from precisely the ratio between her hips and shoulders, which is femininity embodied. Well, so yeah, I'm agreeing.
Right, but I'm just saying that like it's not about physical beauty. Like that's I don't know why she's famous. I couldn't tell you. But
suggests good functionality.
Like it's not about
that you mentioned.
Yeah, but we shouldn't be talking shit about.
It makes me think about Harry's mom, right? So I think that's like another side of it, right? So there's the totally ordinary, there's the sort of archetypal or the feminine ability to give birth, but then there's this lingering question about what Harry's mom exactly did in that moment, and it's explained as love, right? So far as we understand it, this great love that she had, which is now still protecting Harry, and so that seems to be like we're seeing another illustration of that great theme played out here with the Burrow and Mrs. Weasley,
right.
Which
almost as if the ultimate act of motherhood as sacrifice is like, or that what an orphan gets that no other child gets is the perfect example of the willingness of a human to sacrifice her life so that another human gets a chance at life. So that one sees sort of the pinnacle of existence from the very beginning of one's existence. So obviously he doesn't have a mother, and that's terrible. And it would be much preferable to have a mother rather than a great heroic example. But also what he does have is a real embodied heroic example to follow for the rest of his life in a way that other people do not. Which since we haven't mentioned Neville today, is something that connects Harry to Neville.
Yes.
His parents having, terribly, and, even characters in the story shudder at this, been tortured until they became insane. Instead of giving up their friends, opposite of Peter Pettigrew, who we'll soon find. And so that, so just like the act of motherhood is potentially the act of ultimate sacrifice, giving ultimate meaning to the young child's life, suggesting that someone loved you so much that they would give up their own existence so that you could exist. And that's what Harry can live with, even though he's so mistreated for so much of his life in the beginning of it, that he has a charm over his life that protects him in a way that no one else could understand, potentially. Especially not hyper-rational Luciferian Voldemort.
Yes. Well, I should get going here. I did want to throw that in before we sign off, and I'm glad that Neville was mentioned. So I think that this brings it, I think, for me to a good stopping point for now.
All right. So how about the next 3 chapters? I guess we could do 2 chapters or 3, depending on how much we want to read. 4 is at Flourish and Blots, which would be great. 5 is the Whomping Willow, and then 6 is Gilderoy Lockhart, who we did talk about some today. So
Yeah.
do we want to read through that?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Sure, sounds good.
All right, y'all. Well, thank you very much. And Sarah, thanks for staying up until the
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, I got quiet there. I was listening and I was like, wow, I have literally nothing to contribute.
Well, that's kind of how I felt as I was speaking as well. So
I was like, where's Neville? I need a friend.
yeah. Sorry.
10 points for Gryffindor. 10 points.
Funny. It's something Peterson often says. He's like, I'm at the edge of my thinking now, so I'm going to get incoherent. And I think about half of today was me being at the edge of my thinking and being half incoherent. So thank you. So thank you for abiding that. I apologize.
No.
Yeah, very rough draft.
No.
Very rough draft there. All right, y'all.
All right. I'll see you guys
you later.
later. Talk to you later. All right. Take it easy.
Good night.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.